Diary of a Man in Despair. Friedrich Reck. May 1936.
Spengler is dead, then. And just as a deceased Maharaja has the right to have all his retainers buried with him, this preponderant personality was, a few days later, followed in death by Albers, who had handled his work at the Beck publishing firm. Albers died in a truly grisly fashion. He threw himself under the wheels of the Starnberg train, and his bloody corpse was found on the tracks, legs severed at the thighs. As for Spengler, our last meeting was just a few weeks ago on Bayerstrasse, in Munich. As usual, he had been attired in expensive tweeds. As usual, too, his brow had been dark, and his tone angry, his deep hurt and thirst for revenge on those who had hurt him emerged in a series of striking prognoses. It had been worth one's while to spend time with him. I still remember our first meeting, when Albers brought him to my house. On the little carriage which carried him from the station, and which was hardly built with such loads in mind, sat a massive figure who appeared even more enormous by virtue of the thick overcoat he wore. Everything about him had the effect of extraordinary permanence and solidity, the deep bass voice, the tweed jacket, already, at that time, almost habitual, the appetite at dinner, and at night, the truly cyclopean snoring, loud as a series of buzz saws, which frightened the other guests at my Chiemgau country house out of their peaceful slumbers. This was at a time when he was not really successful, and before he had done an about-face and marched into the camp of the oligarchy of industrial magnates, a retreat which determined his life from then on. It was a time when he was still capable of being gay and unpreoccupied, and when he could sometimes even be persuaded to venture forth in all his dignity for a swim in the river. Later, of course, it was unthinkable that he expose himself in his bathing suit before ploughing peasants and farmhands, or that he climb, a huffing and puffing Triton, back onto the river bank in their presence. He was the strangest amalgam of truly human greatness and small and large frailties that I have ever encountered. If I recall the latter now, it is part of my taking leave of him, and so I am sure it will not be held against me. He was the kind of man who likes to eat alone, a melancholy-eyed feaster at a great orgy of eating. With a certain amusement, I recall one evening when he joined Albers and me for a light supper. It was during the final weeks of the First World War, when there was not a great deal one could set before one's guests. But, discoursing and declaiming the whole time, Spengler finished an entire goose without leaving us, his table companions, so much as a bite. His passion for huge dinners, the check for which was later picked up by his industrial Maecenas, was not his only diverting attribute. After I had met him, still before his first major success, he asked me not to come to visit him at his little apartment, I believe it was on Ignestrasse, in Munich. The reason he gave was that his apartment was too confined, and he wanted to show me his library in surroundings appropriate to its monumental scope. Then, in 1926, after he had found his way to the mighty rulers of heavy industry and had moved to expensive Weidenmayerstrasse on the banks of the Isar, he did, indeed, invite me to see the succession of huge rooms in his apartment there. He showed me his carpets and paintings, and even his bed, which was truly worth seeing, because it looked more like a catafalque, but he became visibly disconcerted when I said that I was still looking forward to seeing the library. After overcoming his reluctance to show it to me, I found myself in a rather small room. And there, on a well-battered walnut bookstand, alongside a row of Ulstein books and detective stories, stood what are commonly called dirty books. But I have never known a man with so little sense of humor and such sensitivity to even the smallest criticism. There was nothing he abhorred so much as humbug, yet along with all the magnificent deductions in the decline of the West, he allowed a host of inaccuracies, inadvertencies, and actual errors to stand uncorrected, such as that Dostoevsky came into the world in St. Petersburg rather than in Moscow, and that Duke Bernhard of Weimar died before Wallenstein was assassinated, and important conclusions were drawn from these errors. Mistakes like these could happen to anyone, but woe to the man who dared make Spengler aware of them. I remember a delightful scene which took place at my house, when, as was his custom after dinner, he fell to lecturing and preaching at the same time that he catechized a follower of his who was present. What was amusing was that this proselyte, who was just back from Africa where he had caught a severe case of malaria, had fallen asleep and was snoring very loudly in his armchair, but between one snore and the next, by the principle of automatic response to his master's voice, he promptly answered, in faultless Spenglerian jargon, every question put to him by the great man. Spengler, the master, might well have been pleased, and he certainly should have been able to laugh at this incident. Instead, he was deeply hurt, and would have nothing to do with the culprit thereafter. To repeat, he was truly the most humorless man I have ever met. In this respect, he is surpassed only by Herr Hitler and his Nazis, who have every prospect of dying of a wretchedness compounded by their own deep-rooted humorlessness and the dreary monotony of public life which, under their domination, has taken on the rigidity of a corpse and is now in its 4th year of suffocating us to death. But he who believes that I want to do Spengler an injury by recounting his many weaknesses is in error. I need not cite his indispensable early work on theocrats, nor the fact that he gave form at last to the presentiments of an entire generation. Whoever has met him knows about the nimbus of the significant that attached to him and that was not dissipated even in his off-guard moments, knows that in him lived on the representation of the best in humanist pedagogy, knows about his countenance, which reflected the same stoicism found in busts of the late Roman period. As to whether or not he ever perceived the rising of the irrational on the horizon of our existence where it can now be seen, whether he sensed that the decline of the West, announced by him was actually only the decline of the world created by Renaissance man in the last 400 years, this I do not know. For it was his destiny that midway in his course he fell into dependency on the heavy industry oligarchy, and this dependency began in time to have an effect on his thinking. I, at least, with the best will in the world, do not otherwise know how to reconcile the truly magnificent prophesying of the approaching Dostoevskian Christianity, made in 1922 in the 2nd volume of Decline, with the technocratic rhetoric which fills his later work. It was his tragedy that a highly intellectualized, and I might say, a seedy teacher kind of negativity, kept him from believing in the gods, much less in God. His followers began to leave him around 1926, when he made his peace with contemporary Germany, not with the Nazis, for I know of no one who hated them as he did, on lying down, in sleeping, and in rising up, but with those businessmen on horseback from the Ruhr, who made themselves the real masters of the state following the downfall of the monarchy and who were more than happy to satisfy Spengler's longing for a lifestyle that was patrician as well as somewhat hedonistic. The surging power of his mind, to which we owe the vision of his early works, was cut off from the time the ravens, not those of St. Anthony, but those of the Messrs. Tyson and Hoche, began to supply his table with good burgundies. Thus was he betrayed by his own Epicurean inclinations and his passion for the rich sauces and incomparable culinary skill of his sisters, who kept house for him. The Nazis, in their so-called newspapers edited by such people as one-time schoolteachers with peculiar records and army lieutenants of the First World War who have done nothing since, are exulting over the fact that Spengler supposedly came around to their way of thinking. They are also saying that, one by one, the same thing is happening to the rest of the opposition. But the second, unpublished volume of Spengler's Years of Decision, the first volume of which nearly made him a martyr, lies safely stored in a bank vault in Switzerland, awaiting the resurrection toward which all our hopes turn.